Welcome back to the Rev and the Rabbi. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
Yes, you are. And we are honored to have with us the esteemed District Attorney of Kings County, the 33rd District Attorney. You remember when it was number 1 and 2, right?
Yes, sure. I just go back to the Howard Golden days. You remember that, right?
Yeah. Thanks for being with us today. You know, the reports of late coming out of Crown Heights have been very, very troubling. We've had attacks after attacks. I think in the last 4 months, some 16 attacks, Mr. DA?
That is correct. We've had a tough period in Crown Heights and Brooklyn. In the city itself, we've had an uptick in hate crimes, and so Brooklyn has had its share. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. But I'd like to also just say that we've also made tremendous progress in Brooklyn in terms of violent crime. For the first time in my lifetime, we had fewer than 100 people killed in Brooklyn. We had 1,000 less robberies, 100 less shootings than 2 years ago. So we've made a lot of progress. Right. But this issue of hate crimes has creeped back into our communities, and it's something that, as a DA, I'm committed to stamping out that kind of hatred.
Is it the climate that we're in right now in our culture that emboldens people to act in this way?
I think there are a lot of factors. I haven't quite figured out what's the cause to happen in Crown Heights. I've met with some community leaders, but it's very important for us to, get a grasp on what's happening now. I believe that, the anti-immigrant movement and a lot of the things has been okay to hate, and I think that is part of what we're seeing acting out in Crown Heights, but that's clearly not the only reason.
Yeah, I mean, looking back, 1991, I remember we called it a pogrom, the attacks on the Jews in Crown Heights, a different period, but yet the hatred was there. And I think the concern is that unless we address this, as I know you will and are, that we could, I don't want to predict, but again, to have that kind of violence would be shameful in New York.
Yeah, it can happen, and if we're not careful, it might. And, this is a community that has lived together since the Crown Heights riots in peace. A few years ago, we were not having hate crimes in that community. So something has triggered some raw emotions there, and I think it's going to be really required for us to sit down with community leaders and to figure out how we're going to do this. Now, as the DA, I've created a hate crimes bureau and it's fully staffed. It's the first full-time hate crimes bureau. We have 6 senior prosecutors and 2 junior prosecutors and investigators because I am going to do 2 things there. I'm going to be on top of these cases. We're going to make sure that these cases result in very stiff penalties for anyone who commits a hate crime, because these crimes are horrendous. They not only impact the person who's been assaulted, but they impact the whole community. They create fear in an entire community. And so we're going to do that, the Hate Crimes Bureau, but it's also going to be forward-facing and try to do education and bring people together. So I want to meet with some community leaders and figure out how we're going to bring communities together.
Reverend Bernard, you and I have been in New York for some time. We have found all kinds of cures in science, in medicine. We have not found a cure for hatred. I remember when I came here, I was out of school. I became a rabbi here. There was hatred then. We've seen hatred all throughout the years. It just doesn't go away. In my case, anti-Semitism, it always manifests itself during many periods, regardless of who's in the White House, regardless of who's elected in other offices. Anti-Semitism seems to be a constant.
It seems to be, and historically we've seen here in New York City, especially with such a large Jewish population, that reality play out again and again. And you're right; it doesn't matter who is in office. This is an ongoing thing, and it's unfortunate, because you would think with the unprecedented increase in education, upward mobility within minority communities, even though we do have that gap, you would think that, it would bring us to another level of sophistication and civility, that we would think beyond this kind of acting out. But the climate changes again and again. And, it becomes even popular to engage in hate.
Yeah. When you arrest some of these people and they get convicted, you try to get into the mindset of a hate monger as to what inspires this person to behave in this fashion?
Absolutely, because in fact, in order to charge a person with a hate crime, and it's important that people understand, it's very difficult. Most crimes, the prosecutor is required to prove two elements: that crime was in fact committed, and that the person who's the accused was the person who committed the crime. Mm-hmm. Hate crimes are the only crime because of that added burden of establishing that it was committed in substantial part because of hatred requires us to prove the motive. We have to actually prove why the person committed the crime. If we're able to prove that they committed the crime, but not that they were motivated by bias, then we're unable to support the hate crime. And so in all of these cases, we try to understand what's caused the person to have hatred. And we find very typical kind of things. Person have mental health issues, people who have very aggressive and hateful social media accounts. But with some people, it's just unclear what caused them to commit this type of crime.
Yeah, it continues to be a mystery. But it's interesting because we hear about it when it takes place. But we don't find out what happens at the end of the day. Are they prosecuted? It can't be proven, so they're let go. How many of these cases are actually prosecuted?
They're all prosecuted, the ones we make arrest, and they're vigorously prosecuted. Sometimes, if you can't prove the hate crime may put an additional penalty, and often will put an additional penalty on the sentence. But the underlying crime is still prosecuted. So if someone is charged with a felony assault, they are still going to receive, the punishment, and it's usually jail time for this kind of assault. The question is if we can add the hate crime added elements, which normally bump up the crime by one degree, and it means you're going to look at more jail time. But we prosecute all these cases, and we're doing much more training now for our prosecutors to be able to explain what causes this. And, we're talking about one type of hate crime, but there's all types of communities that have been experiencing this uptick, including the LGBT community. And so this bureau is really meant to really do a lot of work to try to prevent this from happening in the first place.
Now, you were on Hot 97 at one time. Can I say that on the WABC?
No.
Is that?
No, you
it's too
can't.
late now anyway.
Exactly.
I said it. Okay, hold it against me. But you made a pledge to clear low-level marijuana cases.
Yes.
Why? Why do you think that that's going to make a difference?
I believe as DA of Brooklyn, my obligations are twofold. It's to keep our families safe, but it's also to promote public trust in our justice system. These marijuana arrests were clogging up the system. Years ago in Brooklyn, we had over 15,000 of these marijuana arrests, and the cases never went anywhere. But they did damage trust in our justice system. Over 90% of the people arrested in Brooklyn were people of color, mostly African Americans and Latinos. Over 90%. And although we know that white people also use marijuana, so there was selective enforcement, selective prosecution. And if we really want to battle serious crimes like hate crimes, not only do we have to put more resources into it, but we also have to ensure the trust in our justice system. I will say something very positive. In a few of the hate crime cases that we've seen in Brooklyn, the perpetrator has been caught because a person of the same race as the perpetrator has actually intervened and held them for the police. And so public trust is the key to continuing the progress we've made in public safety. We now prosecute very few of these marijuana cases. In fact, 98% of marijuana cases are no longer prosecuted by my office.
That's interesting because, the whole idea of trust, and you're saying that it's important that the public trust your office, trust the system. because you cannot effectively prosecute without the trust of the public, because
without-
they're the ones that are going to give you information that you need.
So
Right.
let me ask you this, because I want to get back to the hate crimes. I know you've spoken to members of the community. I've spoken to members of the Crown Heights community. There is a fear. There's a genuine fear and legitimate fear. It's not exaggerated. That where people are afraid to walk on the streets, people are afraid to send their kids out because they might get attacked. We saw some of the videos of previous attacks. Someone who was visibly Jewish, just crossing the street, all of a sudden was subjected to an attack. What do you say to the community that has this state of mind right now?
Well, I'm going to work with our police department to make sure that, the fact that we're preventing these crimes from happening. But from my standpoint as the chief law enforcement officer, especially in dealing with cases in our courthouse, that the DA is going to vigorously prosecute these cases. We are going to hold people accountable. These crimes are heinous. They have no place in our community. And if you commit a hate crime and you're arrested, you will be prosecuted and you will be sent to jail.
And sometimes you wonder, does it also have anything to do with the home? Do they hear this stuff at home as well?
I think everything
You
has
know,
to do with the home.
right.
We're men of faith. We understand the importance of family.
Right.
That's the first place of socialization. That's where you learn civility, etiquette,
Right.
manners, respect for human life. And unfortunately, the family unit
Yeah,
is in disintegration in our society, in American culture.
When I was growing up, and I'm sure the same as you would hear stereotypical comments made by people, irresponsible comments. And if you relayed any of that to your parents, they said to you, I don't want to hear that again. I never want to hear that again.
That's right.
It doesn't belong in our house. Now, I understand.
For the most part. And,
Well,
we
no,
grew up in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Not all of America,
No, I
unfortunately,
understand, but
has that
but
kind
I
of
think
response
it
to it.
just confers a particular responsibility, a moral responsibility on parents to do everything they can to say he or she didn't learn it here, didn't learn in our house. We don't behave this way. We don't speak this way. That's where it has to start.
Yeah. And I think we have to do more in our schools. We don't teach civics, but I think more than not teaching civics, we don't necessarily teach people how to live side by side with each other. And, a lot of our schools are in fact segregated. And so I plan to work with, organizations like the ADL to get into our schools, to do training for our young people. I find it more difficult to believe that these crimes will continue if people actually get to know each other. The separation of communities today, because of the economy and because of housing pressures, has really divided us in ways that maybe 10 years ago it was less. And I say this because I grew up in East New York, as the Reverend knows. I did not meet a white classmate until I went to high school in John Dewey High School. That should not be allowed in a place like New York City.
Yeah. Reverend and I said on a recent program that education can make you smart, but not necessarily moral. We've seen in history people who have all kinds of degrees, diplomas, have committed some of the most heinous acts in human history. So we need that moral component in that educational system.
Absolutely.
And people have to also, kids have to see examples of those who be. You want to teach kids honesty, you got to be honest. You want to teach them morality, you got to be moral. It can't just be textbook. They need to see living people who embody those values.
It's Teddy Roosevelt who said, to educate a man in mind and not in morals is to create a menace to society. And that's so true, because that knowledge they can take, but how are they going to use it without a moral compass to guide
So
it?
before we let you go, you became the 33rd district attorney following a tragedy in the office. Talk about your predecessor and how you became DA.
Well, the late, great Ken Thompson was the district attorney of Brooklyn. Immediately preceding me, I was his number two, his chief assistant. And he began the process by which I am continuing of making sure that our justice system becomes a fairer place for our community. And it's very important that we continue what was started under Ken Thompson, which is that our justice system should reflect the values of our community. And And so we're doing that. We're doing that by lessening the amount of time we're asking people to go to prison on low-level offenses and changing policies, but also on something like this, on hate crimes, making sure that the values of our community to say this will not be tolerated is ongoing.
And let's talk about Joe Hines for a minute, who was taken from us. I remember when he opened up the Family Justice Center, named for his mom, because he said, I grew up in a home where my father was physically abusive, and I wanted to do something for my mom, and that Family Justice stands today where you are.
It's the first Family Justice Center that was located in the district attorney's office, and actually Joe Hines, who gave me my first job outside of law school, he would be very proud because I've committed to expanding the Justice Center with the mayor's office so that it will have its entire own floor in the DA's office. Right now it has half a floor. We're expanding the commitment to the Family Justice Center as well as to the resources that it provides to victims and survivors of domestic violence and intimate partner violence.
You know, when you think of Joe Hines, you think of Howard Beach, his vigorous prosecution there. You think of nursing home abuse, his vigorous prosecution there. He did many great things during his lifetime, and I know he'll be remembered.
Yeah, he'll be remembered.
For a lot of those meritorious deeds.
Yeah, a lot of programs. We work with his office in terms of alternative to incarceration and those who are coming out of the system, how they could assimilate back into society healthfully. But before we go, you're a man of faith. Your faith informs you in terms of how you do your job.
Absolutely.
People may not know that.
Absolutely. I attend a lot of different churches in Brooklyn because I'm trying to make sure that the community sees me out there. I believe it's important that I am out there, but I pray daily and I ask God for strength in difficult times. And so I am a man of faith, and I do believe that in order for me to succeed at this job, that I need to have the strength of prayer, but also the wisdom. I will turn to both of you. You know that both of you, Rabbi and Reverend, I've reached out to both of you to ask you what you think about issues and how I should proceed. And I think it's important because I do believe that as clergy and religious leaders, that you have a pulse on the values of our community, and that should be reflected in our justice system.
When I was growing up in New England, you don't mind if I mention New England, especially on this weekend. When I was growing up in New England, you would see in so many communities the courthouse next to a church, next to a synagogue.
Right.
And the reason being what was said over there in the courthouse has to be seen over here, and what was seen over here has to be said over there. There was that reciprocal relationship. So you have been a man of faith over the years. You've gone to many synagogues. I don't know what your attendance record is at synagogues versus churches. Christine Quinn used to say, you know, my dad tells me I go to shul more than I go to church, and I should be in church more, but you're an equal opportunity attendee. And I just want to thank you for all the great work you've done, the legacy you perpetuated. The people of Brooklyn and around the state of New York are very proud of you.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to working with both of you as we combat hate in our communities.
Absolutely. Kings County District Attorney Eric Gonzalez.